Well, friends, it is, I said 12:15, it's now almost 20 past, so let's begin. George will in a sense introduce himself, but I just want to say first, on our behalf, a big thank you to George for giving his time. This is a version of the talk George gave to our Resourcing Faith session a few Saturdays ago, which was at very short notice, and so very few people sitting in Little St Mary's were able to come. It was so good, I thought we'd benefit from being able to hear it again, and George has very kindly agreed to speak. George is not a stranger to Little St Mary's by any stretch of imagination, but though a more regular member of the congregation at St Benet's, and I'll leave him to introduce himself, but thank you to him. He'll speak, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. If you need to go because, the beef is about to burn, then you may, it is allowed. We won't take it personally or think that you've become fundamentally opposed to some line of argument of George's. You can go without feeling, it's being judged or watched. You're free people. Anyway, I'll hand over to George. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for being here, and thank you to Father Rob for the invitation. I am a PhD historian. I'm not an ethicist, nor am I a palliative care practitioner, nor anything else. My expertise is more an interest that has turned into a research endeavor than anything particular. But my PhD research examines the place of religion and moral questions in public life about 100 years ago. And so the similar structure of questions that I spend my days thinking about are relevant here. I am going to speak about my opposition to assisted dying today. I recognize that I'm likely addressing a group of people whose views diverge somewhat, or certainly exist along a spectrum. Some people may not have yet made up their mind. My intention is to even if you disagree, is to provide some challenging and thought-provoking thoughts about the principles generally, and thinking about Christian ethics in relation to them, and this bill in particular. We all know somebody, probably, today, who is either terminally ill, or we know somebody who has had a terminal illness or suffered in pain in death. It is therefore quite heavy material, so please again, if you feel overwhelmed at any moment, do go and probably speak to Father Rob, but certainly, take a minute. I'm going to speak, yes, first about the bill and about the broader practical and questions of principle, and then finish by thinking specifically about how we might come up with a Christian ethic. So let's think firstly about some key terms. We have various things that are talked about in this debate. One is euthanasia. That's not what's being proposed in this bill or talked about in this debate. That is where a doctor intentionally kills a patient upon their request, but what we're talking about in this debate is assisted suicide, which is a doctor or medical practitioner supplying lethal drugs in order for the patient to kill themselves. Assisted dying, though, is the word or the phrase that is often used in this debate. Assisted dying is, I think, a rather unhelpful phrase, because actually polling has shown that people don't understand what it means. I've put it in far too small a print there, which is mainly for my benefit, but a 2021 Survation poll found that only 4 in 10 of those surveyed actually understood that assisted dying meant providing lethal drugs to those with less than 6 months to live. 1 in 10 thought that it referred to existing palliative care, and sort of another 4 in 10, I believe, didn't understand that this was people being provided with drugs to kill themselves. So it is the phrase that is used in the debate, and I may well use it this morning, but I use it with reservation because of its inexactitude. So what this bill proposes before Parliament, I'm sure lots of you will have either watched or followed or heard about the debate last Friday in Parliament, where the bill was passed at second reading, which is the first time that legislation of this type has been voted in favour of in Parliament. It proposes to give mentally competent adults with less than 6 months to live the right to end their lives. And there are various safeguards which include a person requiring the approval of 2 independent doctors and a High Court judge. And the bill is brought forward by the MP Kim Leadbeater, who you can see in the picture there, and it is a private member's bill, so it's not government legislation, it is a bill introduced by an individual backbench MP. And it was introduced first into the Commons on the 16th of October. Just on the 11th of November, the text of the bill was finally published, which gave MPs less than 3 weeks to read and understand the text that they were then going to be debating. And the debate happened on the 29th of November for just 4 hours and 15 minutes, and the vote was then taken. This therefore means that in the new year probably, the bill will now go to the Public Bill Committee, which is the scrutiny mechanism for private members' bills. This is a process that can only happen on various days because the parliamentary process for private members' bills is quite limited. The Hansard Society, which is expert in parliamentary procedure, has analysed the workings of the Public Bill Committee and has shown that private members' bills never get anywhere near as much scrutiny and time for discussion and debate as even mundane matters brought forward through government legislation. So we're talking about the most significant potential social change in Britain since the 1960s, going through a parliamentary process that does not allow very much time for scrutiny. I think that has made a lot of people who are in principle in favour of this change quite concerned about the nature of the process that we are going through in order to think about it. From April the 25th next year, the committee will report. Again, private members' bills are only discussed in Parliament on Fridays, and the debate has to be finished by 2:30. And so there is a very, very small window of opportunity, actually, because there are all sorts of private members' bills in any session, for this to be debated. Before November, it will then be debated and voted on at third reading in the Commons, and amendments, which there will likely be many, will be made and voted on, and at that point, if it passes third reading, which is far from certain at this point, it then goes to the Lords, amendments can be made, it comes back to the Commons, and if those amendments are agreed upon, the bill goes to royal assent and becomes law. However, there will likely be a 2-year implementation phase, so there will not be assisted suicides in Britain if this passes until 2027. So it's complex, the process. There have been other attempts to change the law. These are the 3 most recent. The most recent vote in the Commons was in 2015, which was defeated by 330 to 118. So you can see that in 9 years there has been a very considerable change in opinion in Parliament, and it's a very different Parliament meeting today than met 9 years ago. Other context is that around the world, these are the countries and jurisdictions which have legalized either and or assisted suicide and euthanasia. It's a minority of the world's population. The most famous and first is Switzerland, where it has been legal since 1942, and it's the only country in the world, as you will, I'm sure, know, that permits suicide tourism, as it's called. So people are able to apply to Dignitas or one of the other clinics from wherever in the world and go there in order to be killed. The US 11 states have legalized it. Oregon is the key one, and that is used as a model by lots of campaigners in the UK. More on that. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg are the first of the second wave in Europe, and these are countries that didn't limit the legislation to terminal illness at the start, and they allow both euthanasia and assisted suicide. Canada, then, is an example that is much talked about in the media because the law was only changed in 2016 by Parliament, was then extended in 2021 and looks set to be extended again in 2027. So you can see there that the pace of change, once legalised, is quite rapid. Australia, New Zealand, likewise. Note that New Zealand held a referendum on this during the lockdowns and voted 65-35 in favour of this, which strikes me as a very, very inappropriate time to be making such decisions. There are other countries as well, and a few where court rulings allow it on a case-by-case basis, but it isn't legislated by Parliament. This was the vote from last Friday. You can see 330 to 275. It was split down party line, not by party lines, I should say. A remarkable fact is that 330 is the exact number who voted against in 2015, which is quite an extraordinary coincidence. Just some final scene setting, some supporters. I'm sure you'll know lots of these people. And the campaigning organisations at the top there that have long campaigned for a change in the law. There are a number of prominent celebrity endorsees, particularly Dame Esther Rantzen, who has been much talked about in the media. On that list is also the MP for Cambridge, who voted in favour. And here are some more. What is quite remarkable about these slides is the coalitions for and against that have formed. People that would never ever be standing next to each other in the division lobbies are forced together because this is an issue that truly confounds political categorization. Although I saw one commentary online which I thought was very astute, which is that on the right, this splits libertarians from conservatives, and on the left, this splits socialists from progressives. I don't think that probably applies in all cases, but I think that gives food for thought when you drill into who voted how. Opponents, likewise, extraordinary range. The Church of England's hierarchy has come out quite strongly against assisted dying. Both archbishops, former Archbishop Rowan, you can see a number of disability activists on that list as well as both the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, and the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, the two government departments that would actually be tasked with implementing this. And that slide is just absolutely extraordinary. You know, this is truly a spectrum of British politics, and yet they all agree that this bill is wrong. So, turning to the question in hand. When we think about assisted dying, we tend to focus on challenging cases, those presented to us in the media, such as that of Dame Esther. We are told that they and countless others are suffering in great pain with no hope of recovery or relief. Those that we're talking about tend to be people who have quite a considerable deal of agency. They are well supported and they have loving families. And we imagine that this will be a legislative change that will only impact a handful of people and that will bring much needed relief to a small number of terminally ill people right at the end of their lives. Couched in those terms, it might, I think, seem reasonable on the face of it to imagine that assisted dying could indeed be a good thing and could reduce suffering. But the problem is that that is not the reality. The question becomes immediately more complicated when you think about those who aren't well loved, or who live with chronic pain, or who are disabled. It also seems to deny the reality of what effective palliative care can do in terms of pain relief in almost all, though not all, cases. Campaigners in favour seek to conduct this debate almost exclusively in terms of pain. But the problem is that survey data from around the world shows that when enacted, assisted dying legislation is not principally used as a means of granting relief from pain. The 2023 Oregon Health Report lists the most frequently cited reason for pursuing this. 91% said for autonomy, 88.3% for decreasing ability to participate in activities that made life enjoyable, 63.8% cited loss of dignity. Only 34.3% of people who sought an assisted death in Oregon said that inadequate pain control or fear of inadequate pain control was a reason for them. And if you only remember one thing from today's event, make it that statistic. This is not a debate about pain and relief from pain, and the bill before Parliament makes no mention of pain at all in its eligibility criteria. These statistics from Oregon are mirrored elsewhere, and they show why in this debate the old adage rings true, that hard cases make bad laws. Though we imagine this being about desperately sad cases, the reality is that assisted dying laws quickly become a means for people to achieve control over their own mortality. Supply in this case generates demand, and the numbers seeking to access assisted dying steadily start to rise. The safeguards in the legislation, therefore, are increasingly challenged, and laws tend to be amended and/or expanded. This is because this is a question of autonomy at its heart, and this is the goal of most of its proponents. I should, of course, say that most opponents are, of course, motivated by compassion, and I do not in any way challenge or question the motives of most. But there are some in this debate who have been in it a long time and are very, very much motivated by ideology. One, for example, is Ludwig Minelli, who is the founder of the Dignitas Clinic in Switzerland. He believes in death on demand and argues that autonomy is a human right that overrides all others. He says if you accept the idea of personal autonomy, you can't make conditions that only terminally ill people should have the right. These convictions are shared by groups in the UK, such as the Humanists, My Death, My Decision, and Dignity in Dying. My Death, My Decision calls on its website for assisted dying that permits a medically assisted death to adults of sound mind who are terminally ill or intolerably suffering. It was also the case that as the bill was being introduced, there was a group of 54 MPs who called on Kim Leadbeater to extend the bill beyond the terminally ill to include the incurably suffering. And a couple of MPs during the debate last Friday made similar requests. And of course, it's not very surprising that they would call for such an extension, because the problem is that if you concede the idea that assisted dying is a means of ending suffering, it is wholly arbitrary then to insist that it should be only for the terminally ill. What about those who are not terminally ill but who suffer from chronic pain? What about those who suffer from mental health problems that won't kill them? Indeed, given that death is not imminent for them, surely following this logic, they are actually more deserving of an assisted death because they have no promise of an impending death. The cry for extension to the existing legislation will inevitably go up, therefore, likely through a legal challenge via the ECHR, and the safeguards in this bill will be eroded because they have been eroded in some way in every single jurisdiction in the world where assisted suicide has already been legalized. The proponents of this bill, therefore, are not being honest when they say that this is just for the terminally ill. That is not something that they can promise. And indeed, Kim Leadbeater shows, I believe, quite an extraordinary misunderstanding of how parliamentary process works. She has repeatedly argued that once the law has become law, it cannot be changed because Parliament is sovereign. If Parliament is sovereign, it can therefore change the law however it likes. She argues that because it has terminally ill in the title, that it will not therefore extend beyond the terminally ill. But there is nothing about the title of legislation that binds MPs in terms of its contents. Lord Sumption, who is in favour of assisted suicide, argues that once the law changes, it will likely be deemed discriminatory to deny others the same right. And a number of barristers are saying that they will take cases to this effect if this becomes law. And another thing is, what is a terminal illness? That's at the heart of this. That's the legal principle that is being established. But it is a legal principle established on a very shaky medical foundation. There are lots and lots of people who are given a terminal diagnosis who are in fact not terminally ill. And doctors say that you can quite confidently make a terminal diagnosis if somebody has days or weeks to live. But when it becomes a question of months, it's a much more inexact science. So that's just a picture as well that shows you some of the campaigners and the rhetoric they are using. Choice is at the heart of it. That's Lord Sumption, there we go, I've forgotten my slides. Let's have a look at what has happened elsewhere in order to give you some data for this. And Canada is the most striking example. The Canadian Parliament voted in 2015 to legalise both assisted suicide and euthanasia. Just 6 years later, in 2021, that same Parliament confirmed an extension to the provision whereby those suffering from serious or chronic, though not terminal conditions, could also apply by what they called Track 2 of their Medical Assistance in Dying programme, or MAID. So whereas in 2016 only 1,018 people died as a result, in 2022 the number was 13,241. That represents 4% of all deaths in Canada in 2022, in comparison to just 2.5% of all deaths in 2020. Legislation to extend the provision to include mental illness is tabled for 2027, as well as plans to extend the eligibility down to those who are as young as 12. And the Canadian Medical Association and the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer have both produced analyses showing how the MAID programme is saving the Canadian taxpayer hundreds of millions of Canadian dollars a year, something that the government has boasted about there. John Donne, in his famous No Man is an Island, went on to say that any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. Assisted dying law does not impact a tiny handful of cases, nor simply an ever-growing number of cases, but all of us. This is because when we change the law, we bring about changes in social practice, public opinion, and the moral framework we all exist within. In 1967, when abortion was legalized, the Act permitted it on health rather than social grounds. However, since then, over 10 million abortions have been carried out in the UK, a very large percentage of which have been for social reasons and not for health reasons. Though there was widespread opposition in the 60s to legalizing abortion, it's now largely uncontroversial. And I'm making no judgment either way about this. My purpose is simply to state that when we change the law, we cannot predict the changes in attitude that come about with it. The Netherlands is the country, apart from Switzerland, where assisted suicide has been legal for longest. It's 40 years this year. And I want to show you where the debate has come to in the Netherlands. In 2016, the Dutch government brought forward proposals to liberalise assisted dying further, seeking to permit it for anyone over the age of 75 who felt that they had a completed life and for whom life had lost its meaning. Those were the words used in the bill. This was defeated, but the same political party has brought forward similar legislation in 2020, again in 2023, and are about to introduce it once again to the Dutch Parliament. And they're being cheered on by the leading Dutch pro-euthanasia campaign group, which campaigns to allow anyone over the age of 70 to kill themselves and has introduced these mock last will pillboxes, which it hopes, once this law becomes law, will be issued, well, people will be able to have these, and one of these peppermints will have a lethal dose, and so they think that this is a humane way for people to die. This, I apologise for how blunt that is, but that is where the debate is in the Netherlands 40 years on. That is not the debate that we saw in Parliament last Friday. And campaigners brush off such examples and insist instead that Oregon is the example that the UK should follow. But in Oregon, there are reported cases of people being given assisted suicide for anorexia. There are 60 cases now reported worldwide of people suffering from terminal anorexia, sciatica, arthritis, complications from a fall, and one case where somebody in Oregon was given assisted suicide because they had a hernia. And we don't know the precise details in much of Oregon because there is no requirement for assisted suicide cases to be reported to the Oregon Health Authority. And so when people cite Oregon as an example of the numbers not increasing, the numbers A, have increased, but B, we don't actually know what the numbers are because they're not properly reported. Proponents of assisted dying deny, I think sometimes, that life has an intrinsic value and that humans have an intrinsic dignity and worth. Because unfortunately, in making these arguments, they conceive of life as having instrumental value. Value insofar as it is lived independently, or lived free from pain, or lived without disability. When those conditions aren't met, they argue that life has lost its value and that people in such situations do not have dignity. This naturally requires that a subjective force defines what is and isn't valuable or meaningful or dignified in human life. This means that the exercise of autonomy in deciding one's own morality brings about greater societal inequality, because those who possess less autonomy or who are thought to possess less worth or value by society are most likely to be victims of a change in the law. Those who desire greater autonomy in this area tend to be those who already enjoy considerable autonomy. And they will, I think, unfortunately succeed in ripping autonomy from those who already lack it if this bill passes. Justin Welby said in the Lord's debate in 2021, "It does not serve compassion if by granting the wishes of one closest to me, I expose others to danger. And it does not serve dignity if in granting the wishes of one closest to me, I devalue the status and safety of others." The legendary Dame Cicely Saunders, founder of the modern hospice movement, agreed. She argued that any law permitting voluntary euthanasia pulls the rug from under the vulnerable. Rhetoric on the other side, from Baroness Mary Warnock, the late philosopher, she said that if you're demented, you're wasting people's time, people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. I shudder to think what she means by demented people, but they are among the most vulnerable in our society. The Paralympian and disability rights campaigner Tanni Grey-Thompson therefore says, perhaps the next time the notion of autonomy arises in this debate, people should spare a thought for disabled people's autonomy. Unless we forget that Jesus said, "That which you did for the least of these, you did for me." The actor Liz Carr produced a fantastic BBC documentary, which I heartily recommend, which investigated the impact of assisted suicide on those who live with disabilities. Carr recounts numerous occasions when she has been told by members of the public that if I were like you, meaning in a wheelchair, I'd rather be dead. She believes that given her condition, she likely could qualify as having a terminal illness under a loose definition of terminal, and she worries greatly about the temptation that might pose to her when she is feeling depressed. Recent studies likewise have found that healthcare providers often mistakenly assume that the quality of life of their disabled patients is poor. And unfortunately, ableist perspectives are often found among medical professionals. A 2024 report of the UN Special Rapporteur of Rights of People with Disabilities found that in the UK there is a pervasive framework and rhetoric that devalues disabled people's lives and which tells disabled people that they are undeserving citizens. And this is seen in statistics such as education, housing, transport, employment. For example, just 6% of people who have an intellectual disability are currently in employment. This means that life for many disabled people in the UK is made difficult, and in some cases made unbearable. That is not to say that disabled people are themselves unable, or that there has been great progress, but a society marred by inequality will not ensure that assisted suicide is handed out on an equal basis. The Labour MP Florence Eshalomi, I'll just skip forward to this, was, I think, one of the outstanding contributors in the debate on Friday. She said that true compassion should have equality at its heart. How can we be sure that this bill will allow equality and freedom in death when we do not yet have equality and freedom in life? Canada, again, provides some worrying examples. I want to, I haven't got it, do I? I was going to use that one. I'm going to use this one instead, which is that a former Paralympian in Canada called Christine Gauthier in 2022 applied for a mobility ramp to be installed in her house. She's a wheelchair user. She was told that the wait would be very considerable. She tried again and again to encourage the authorities to install this ramp. And on one occasion, she was asked whether she had considered assisted suicide instead, because the wait for the ramp would be so long. Now, that is an extreme case, but unfortunately, I think that with the pressures on the health service and on resources that we have in this country, things like that would be inevitable at some point in Britain, and I think that we need to take that very seriously. In 2023, Oregon, as I say, held up by UK campaigners as the model to follow, found that of the people accessing the service of assisted suicide, 43% said that one of the reasons they were doing so was because they did not want to be a burden on others. In neighboring Washington state, that number was as high as 57% in the same year. It is undeniable that there will be a minority of cases where frail and elderly people are coerced by family members into dying, and I think that the proposed safeguards would be utterly toothless in rooting out and identifying this. More on that in a sec. Age UK reports that 400,000 people at any one time in the UK are experiencing abuse. So this is not a small concern. There is also an epidemic of loneliness among older people. But perhaps the most pressing concern is that changing the law would bring in covert pressure on the elderly, not to burden relatives or to make them wait for their inheritance in an increasingly difficult economy. And so lots of older people might think, I've had a good innings, I'll do the selfless thing, I'll die so that my children can get on in life. That's why people say that a right to die can easily become a duty to die. Kim Leadbeater, quite extraordinarily to my mind, in an interview before the debate, said that being a burden, she thought, might be a legitimate reason for people to access this. I disagree profoundly. I think that any time anyone thinks that they are a burden, it is our responsibility to ensure that they are not. Our NHS is nearing the point of collapse, quite simply. Healthcare providers are stretched to intolerable limits, and health outcomes in this country are worsening rather than improving. Given this, I think that the idea of legalizing assisted suicide now is a deeply concerning prospect. This is, bluntly speaking, because of the incentives that assisted dying would introduce for our struggling, cash-strapped health system. Nor, unfortunately, is this hypothetical. During the COVID pandemic, the Do Not Resuscitate scandal saw an inappropriate and blanket application of this order being placed on older and disabled patients as scarce resources were prioritized on the basis of age, health, and able-bodiedness. Matthew Paris, the Times journalist, shocked many earlier this year when he wrote similarly, saying the quiet part about this out loud. In response to claims that elderly people will worry about being a burden, he wrote, "I believe this will indeed come to pass, and I would welcome it." He went on to say, "I don't apologize for the reductivist tone in which this column treats human beings as units." He believes that the money spent on caring for the dying, which is a huge part of the NHS budget, could be better spent elsewhere. I believe, and that's just a slide that shows you the cost-benefit analysis in places like Canada, which has shown that this is a policy that saves money. That's the Canadian Paralympian. Our focus, I think, instead should be on investing in making good deaths. Dignity in Dying talks about giving people dignity. Well, I wonder whether they should have spent the last few decades campaigning also for improvements in palliative care, which they don't do. A great deal of suffering that is experienced by the terminally or chronically ill can be remedied through better palliative care. Indeed, pain, in almost all cases, but not all, should never be unbearable, given the advances that we have made in palliative care. Conversely, the great desire of many for assisted suicide is the direct result of a lack of suitable palliative and hospice care. And there remains a postcode lottery in the UK with considerable unmet palliative care needs. Hospice UK estimates that currently 100,000 people die in the UK every year without access to proper palliative care. And that is disproportionately the poorest and most marginalized in our society. A recent report also projected that 92% of hospices will be in deficit this year, and in a third of cases, those deficits will be more than £1 million. More funding comes from hospices through charity shop sales than it does through government spending. And the end-of-life charity Marie Curie found in a 2023 report that palliative care in Britain is no better today than it was 70 years ago. I think that's really quite unacceptable. And in choosing assisted dying over properly funding palliative care, I think we take the easy route out, rather than seeking to obviate the need or the desire that people have to die in the first place. And palliative care will suffer further if assisted dying is legalized, because resources will be redirected in order to fund it. Research from the Anscombe Centre for Bioethics in Oxford shows how countries that implement assisted suicide fall down the rankings on palliative care compared to others. The promised funding, which we heard a lot about in the debate last Friday, never materializes. And the countries in Europe without assisted suicide increased their palliative care investment in the last decade by more than 3 times those that had legalized it. And the same pattern is seen within the US in comparison to states that have and haven't legalized. That is very clear. Tellingly, I'm afraid very few people calling for assisted dying, as I say, have spent much time championing palliative care. Their energies, and a lot of our energies, I think, have been badly misdirected, because it remains the case that effective palliative care in the vast majority of cases can enable people to die with dignity. Dame Cicely Saunders said, "You do not have to kill the patient to kill the pain." A further thought is that 300 hospice beds currently are closed due to critical funding and staffing pressures in the UK. 300 beds is 14% of the total capacity. There was also quite an extraordinary scene where, just as the debate ended on Friday, further private members' bills were being introduced for first reading. And one backbench Labour MP was introducing his private member's bill for greater funding for children's hospices, which was objected to by the duty government whip. And so that debate now won't be happening, just after several hours of cross-party consensus that more palliative care funding was needed. Campaigners have said that if assisted suicide is legalised on the NHS, there will be a fully state-funded service for people being able to end their lives by assisted suicide, but there will be only a partially state-funded hospice sector. That seems to me to be off. Let's think about the safeguards. The safeguards require 2 doctors to sign off before a patient is granted for this. Those doctors need never have met the patient before or treated them. There is then no requirement that the primary doctor conducts an in-depth investigation or interviews the family or looks into who the financial beneficiaries might be in the case of the patient's death. Doctors themselves receive no training in coercion detection, and so it is unlikely that in many cases with such surface-level box ticking, cases involving coercion would very likely not be picked up. The primary doctor in this bill also has the ability to select the second doctor and can hire and fire their colleagues until they find one who will agree with them. A High Court judge is then required to assess the decision and to confirm or reject it. They do not need to hold a hearing. They can choose, if they do hold a hearing, to hold it on Zoom. And as a number of senior retired judges have pointed out, there will not be enough capacity in the family court to ensure that this safeguard is meaningful. And it seems highly unlikely that a judge who hasn't even met the patient can make a more informed decision than 2 doctors who have. Sir James Munby, very senior former head of the family division of the High Court, argues that only those who believe implicitly in judicial omniscience and infallibility can possibly have any confidence in the efficacy of what is proposed. The bill also, highly unusually, gives no facility for appeal, no requirement for the next of kin to be contacted, and requires the whole process to be conducted in secrecy. The safeguards proposed are therefore staggeringly weak, and there are already calls from some MPs to water them down further or to extend the scope of the eligibility further. And quite an extraordinary argument, I thought, in response to some claims by campaigners in Parliament on Friday that coercion might be undetected in these safeguards. The response of a number of MPs co-sponsoring this bill was to claim that currently there is considerable coercion in the UK, and by that they meant that families apparently currently try and stop their relatives from taking their own lives, as if that's a problem. In all of the countries in which assisted suicide has been legalised, there's also strong evidence for a negative impact on doctors. They are the ones tasked with assessing this and with issuing the drugs. The campaign group Living and Dying Well found that between 30 and 50% of clinicians found a considerable emotional burden or discomfort which arose from this. And under this bill, a doctor is able to bring up as one of a number of clinical options an assisted death in a consultation with a patient. Now, given that consultations, there is a power imbalance between a medical professional and often somebody who is very vulnerable, the idea of it being brought up and suggested as one of a number of options strikes me as a very bad idea. Another astounding statistic is this. In Oregon, in 2022, one doctor wrote 12% of the prescriptions for assisted suicide drugs in the entire state. That's quite extraordinary. And this reflects the reality of doctor shopping. Doctor shopping is not prevented under this bill. And that is that if you can't get one doctor to approve you for this, another may take a different view. And all around the world, there are doctors who have a very strong ideological desire to enable patient autonomy that are much happier to say yes than other doctors. And people end up going to them in order to seek this, and they end up spending the entirety of their professional lives dealing with these cases because other doctors don't want to. There is also quite concerning evidence from the British Medical Journal and others of the effect of these drugs on dying patients. We're told that this is a simple and pain-free end, but actually the drugs used are very often the same drugs that are used on death row in America. And they are drugs that in some ways remain quite experimental, and people have failed in taking them to be induced into unconsciousness. And one of the most common ways in which a complication arises is that people end up vomiting as a result of these drugs because their body reacts badly to them, and they end up dying by choking on their own vomit. That is appalling. And a final point before I turn to Christian ethics, as I promised, is that in the medium to long term, legalizing assisted dying helps to normalize suicide in broader society, the statistics show, because suicide is something contagious. In the Netherlands, this is clearly the case. The non-assisted suicide rate has risen exponentially in the 23 years since there was a legislative change in the law. In 2007, that was 8.3 per 100,000 deaths by suicide. 10 years later, that was 11.2 per 100,000. Now, of course, there are a whole range of factors involved there, but there is a clear correlation in this and a number of other statistics. A House of Lords committee in 1994, when assessing this question, therefore concluded that none of the arguments made by proponents of change were strong enough to weaken society's prohibition of intentional killing, which is the cornerstone of law and social relationships. The current law as it stands has a steadfast firewall, which is that always and everywhere intentional killing is wrong. That, I believe, is a much stronger safeguard for the vulnerable, and indeed for all of us, than removing that firewall and hoping that improper cases won't fall through the net. So to turn to Christian ethics more particularly, to put this into a broader perspective. Religious arguments, unfortunately, in this debate are very often discounted. People bristle when they hear people talking about their faith, and they say that Christians should keep quiet and shouldn't be imposing their views on others. I believe, though, that Christian ethics provides a much stronger basis upon which to build a compelling account of life and of death than often vaguely humanistically defined values that, as I say, tend to discriminate, become contested, and deny the worth of many who do not meet the often arbitrary and subjective standards that they set. Now, in going forward, again, I make no claims to have the final answer on what a Christian ethical perspective should be on this question, but this is what I have come up with. In emphasizing life as an inalienable right and neglecting the idea of it being a gift from God, we have often upheld, I believe, a rather shallow version of life's value and meaning. Our demand, above all else, for individual autonomy represents a usurpation of our corporate life shared in the body of Christ. We are made for relationships of mutual support and self-giving love, and it is our calling as Christians to recognize that our identities are made whole in and through Christ, and not through us achieving individual autonomy. Karl Barth wrote that life is something that cannot be owned, only lived. In claiming autonomy as individuals, rather than recognizing that our autonomy is inherently relational, we claim something that we cannot own, and we usurp, as a result, what it means to be human. We are created in the image of a God whose very being is relational. Individualistic autonomy is therefore not possible, and in God's created order we are assembled into one body. Paul therefore commanded the Galatians to carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. We are called to a life of mutual burdensomeness. Dependence is not dehumanizing for Christians, as many argue. Rather, it is an essential expression of our humanity that is brought to fullness through relationship. In the light of Christian theology, the value of human life lies not in our freedom to decide our own value, but in the freedom to acknowledge and serve the value that is given to us by God. And that value is best understood in terms of being dignified by our opportunity and our obligation to respond to that call. Our dignity is not instrumental in that it does not derive from our rational capacity or our ability to live independently or free from pain. Rather, each of us is blessed with the precious gift of a life molded in God's own image. In our rich diversity, we are fearfully and wonderfully made and share a common humanity. This is the surest ground for establishing that our worth is integral, and it is the radical equality among humans as children of God that provides such a striking rebuff to the many aforementioned instances of equality, particularly for people like disabled people. It is in recognizing that each person, able-bodied, disabled, is a gift from God that we discern the evil that is discrimination against the latter group. Our dignity and worth are not just in being made in the image of God, but also in being called to serve as co-creators with God. We function to continue and expand the work of creation, and this work points beyond ourselves to God's own glory. It is hard, therefore, to imagine a position of greater meaning and value. Our life cannot be meaningless, and it can never be robbed of dignity. In John's Gospel, we learn that Jesus came to give us abundant lives. To live a life of abundance is not to live a life that is devoid of suffering, or a life that flees from the reality of death. Living lives of fullness require us to live in ways that reveal our love for God, for self, and for one another. In this way, death is no longer an enemy. Death is reframed in the light of the resurrection and the promise that death has been swallowed up in Christ's victory on the cross. Death remains painful and difficult, but it is no longer the ultimate enemy. I do not wish to sanitize death. Jesus wept when he heard that Lazarus had died. But Jesus' own life was not free from pain, suffering, loneliness, or death. His life enables us to integrate death within a narrative of hope. Death is reimagined as an integral aspect of life, and to live the life of Christ requires us to die here and now. Those who hope in God as Redeemer must enter into the vulnerable, suffering love that leads to the cross. The Christian life, therefore, draws us into an ongoing death in which we die to everything that thwarts God's purposes for us. Suffering presents Christians with a challenge. The church that is formed on the rock of a suffering Saviour is empowered to live out a story within which it is called to share in Christ's sufferings. God does not promise freedom from suffering, but he promises to give us a context in which that suffering can be potentially transformative. In Christ's sufferings, we discover a redemptive identification of God with humanity. Christians will still suffer and die, but the meaning of suffering and dying is transformed by the knowledge that God, in his true powers, suffers with us and incessantly calls humanity back to himself, even in the midst of our suffering. Paul teaches the Romans, therefore, that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Many argue that we live in a death-denying culture. Think of the way in which most death is now conceived of as a medical event, and it usually takes place in hospital. Some perhaps think of death as something that needs to be battled against at all costs, and idealize the preservation of life above the eradication of suffering. That is certainly not what I am proposing here. Advances in medical technology have made it possible to prolong life, and that life is sometimes of very poor quality. And therefore, we are talking here about a much broader discussion of how we promote good death in a society that is living longer. But I believe that assisted suicide is not the answer to this difficult question, though it may appear to be an obvious solution. Rather, Christians, I believe, have a role to play in speaking into our cultural fear of death and in challenging the misplaced desire of some to prolong life in ways that go way beyond its natural cause. The desire for assisted dying is often a deep cry for despair. And in rejecting this, we must not reject or cast over that cry. In rejecting assisted suicide, we must commit ourselves more resolutely to enhancing the alternatives. Our faith calls us out of a state of passivity or simply not doing harm to others, through an active call for us to serve others and help alleviate suffering wherever we see it. Our compassion is therefore expressed through our engagement. Palliative care is an example, perhaps the best example of this response, and it is fundamentally rooted in Christian tradition and pioneered by Christians. And I will therefore give the last word to Dame Cicely Saunders. She explained, in her lifelong opposition to euthanasia, her belief in palliative care. She said, "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die." Thank you.
George, thank you very much. Three things. The first is that George has very kindly agreed to make these slides available, so I will email them out. This is also being live streamed and will stay on our YouTube channel for a week if anybody wants to look at it again or share it with somebody who wasn't able to be here. The second thing is that, noting what George says, that tonight's collection after the Advent Carol service will be divided between this parish's work and the Arthur Rank Hospice here in Cambridge. And thirdly, George has kindly agreed to take questions. What I think will make this work, right? First of all, if you have any questions, if you do have a question, I might ask George to repeat it down the microphone so we can all hear it.
Or comments, disagreements, all welcome. Father Ed. Father Ed is asking for me to draw upon my expertise. That's not what you said. I don't have any expertise as a historian. To think about how we've got here and why there has been a change, particularly in Parliament. I think that on a simple level, it's because there are lots of new MPs and new MPs who are, I think they fit into the progressive category on the left rather than the socialist one. You'll note, of course, that Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn, all of these people are opposed to assisted suicide. But a lot of new, quite young MPs who are quite metropolitan, very often don't have a faith at all, are more inclined to be susceptible to the arguments here. And I think that the debate on Friday is an interesting one because I don't think lots of MPs were very clear quite what they were debating. Some were arguing that the debate was about the principle, and that in voting in favour of the principle, they could then go on and discuss it, and then maybe change their mind at third reading if they're not in favour of the particulars. Other MPs said that we're voting on the bill in front of us. So I think that this represents a shift in opinion, which I think is in many ways replicated in the public, in favour of a change in the principle. But I think that the bill is far from passing, and its passage is far from confirmed, because there are lots of MPs who were willing to lend their vote in order for the debate to continue. But I think that the decline of faith is inevitably one of the key reasons here, because though, of course, as I've acknowledged already, there are people of faith who agree with this change and have good Christian reasons for doing so, they are a minority, and people of faith are almost all across the various faiths in our society opposed. Yes. Thank you. The question is, does this change arise from society's nihilistic view of life and the idea that death is the ultimate way of escaping pain? I see a great flaw in the logic of proponents here, because they are arguing for autonomy. By any philosophical definition, death is the ultimate denial of human autonomy. And so the way of supplying autonomy is apparently to rip it away. I think that's completely wrong. And I think that there are lots of testimonies in this debate of people, either themselves or have loved ones, who have at times in their life, experiencing great pain and great suffering, wanted to end their lives, whether themselves or being able to by the state. But that will to die is not continuous. It ebbs and flows. Likewise, people experiencing terminal illness, very often they have undiagnosed mental health problems that come as a result of this. Likewise, they feel at times great despair. They have good days and bad days. The problem is that death, there is no coming back from. As a society, I think quite rightly, but you may disagree, we oppose the death penalty. And one of the main reasons people have for that is because there is no second chance. If actually the person is found to be innocent, that's it. Well, this is it as well. If you get a wrong terminal diagnosis, if on one day you felt depressed and were allowed to go in for this, but actually later you might have changed your mind, there's no way of changing your mind. I think we need to think a lot more seriously about the things that I was talking about at the end, how we help people alleviate pain so that they don't think that death is the only answer. Yes. That's a really, really great question. For those who couldn't hear, the question of what about withdrawing treatment? At what point are we killing? I suppose when we dose people up on a lot of morphine, or we acquiesce to their request for them not to have the operation that we think could help. It's difficult, and it has long been debated by medical ethicists. There is, however, in this country a long-established and widely held principle of double effect, which is that there is a difference between intention and foresight, which is held widely by medical practitioners, which is that if you allow a patient, because they are allowed to say no to treatment, if you agree with that, it is legitimate if your intention is not to kill them, but your intention is for them not to undergo an operation that they say that they would be unable to, physically or emotionally. That, I think, is an important moral distinction from intending to kill them. Indeed. Although in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, it's the children that make the decision, which strikes me as a difficult area as well. This is what palliative care practitioners do as well. Very often palliative care practitioners, the palliative care, the end of it is not to prolong life. You enter palliative care once you know that you're going to die, and the idea of it, therefore, is that your suffering is alleviated and your pain is managed. And so some of the practices of palliative care will, in some cases, hasten death. But the intention is not to do so. The intention is not to kill the patient or to allow them, because they want to die. The intention is for them to have their suffering alleviated. The question becomes more difficult when we think about prosecution. Keir Starmer, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, basically brought in a principle whereby if you are found, for example, to be travelling with a relative to go to Switzerland, which is illegal under the 1961 Suicide Act, because that is seen as assisting suicide, though you are liable to a charge of a sentence of up to 14 years in prison, basically it's not implemented. So the current legal situation we have is that if you assist in a suicide and that's your intention, this is a slightly different point but related, you won't be prosecuted. That strikes me as a slightly awkward situation. And so, yes, there are lots of difficult questions in this realm, but I don't think that the answer to this question about the difference between intention and foresight, or withdrawing treatment and facilitating death, is to allow assisted suicide. I think that's not. I think that's an answer to a very different question. But thank you. Any more for any more? There we go. The window is closing.
George, thank you so much. Hugely grateful to you for that. If people have further things they'd like to ask or talk about, I shall dangle around for a little bit. Do feel free to speak to me or to email me or to arrange to speak if this has brought up things you want to explore further. I would urge you certainly to write to your MP. If your MP, like mine, is the MP for Cambridge, Mrs. Ackman will benefit from your correspondence, I'm sure. Always worth reminding him that this was not always been a safe Labour seat, and it may not be again. And don't tell Father Mark. Father Mark, for those of you who may not know this, Father Mark was a candidate for Parliament in 1990. He's not here, it's all right. He's only watching online. Was a candidate for Parliament in 1992. So he can point out to you that Parliament seats can change. As I said, I'll forward these slides via email, and this will be on YouTube for a week. Thank you very much, and thank you to George once more.
just as you go out, I'll just leave that up, which is a selection of resources that I've found helpful. If anyone would like to think more about this, I can recommend any of these. Yes. Thank you. It depends whether it's raining or not. Yeah. Well, yes, we could just leave it here anyway. I'll deal with it in due course. Yes? Well, I think let's leave it here.
Yes,
Just
it is. It's not
Devin
totally
said
dry.
don't
There
worry.
is snow. Perhaps.
What a great son you've got.
No, I was just. Sorry.
Right. Where would you like it?
That's a very good question. Let's just, rather than you dragging it back in the rain and the cold.
I just checked outside. There is a bit of rain still.
I think I'll just file it. And out of here, and we can cause it to go back to the. Don't think there's any urgency, I think.
Oh no.
As far as we're aware. Never think of his cows.
No. Okay. Right, I think I've got everything. Right.
Okay.
Yes, I think so. Yes. Yes, with the slides.